Hello, everyone. Good to be with you for our next lesson. So, we're talking about the theme of atonement here and looking at this lesson from Acts chapters 27 and 28. So, now we have Paul actually traveling through the sea, suffering shipwreck, and then coming out of that to finish the rest of his journey, which we'll conclude with our next lesson. So, talking about atonement here, thinking through the title of this lesson, Paul's resurrection. Notice I have this in quotations if you're not looking at the screen, because I mean to convey the idea that Paul has been resurrected from the symbolic death that he died as being tossed into the sea. Remember, we talked about with our previous session how that is a whole Bible picture for conduit to the abode of the dead, Sheol, and whatnot. So many other stories in the Old Testament seem to suggest this idea. And of course, Jesus himself passing through the murky, quote, waters of death after he was crucified before he's resurrected on the other end. But Paul's resurrection is a symbolic new exile ending Passover deliverance. So, three different columns here. In the far left, Moses and Israel compared to Jesus, and then compared to Paul. So, I don't want to read all of these together, but just, I should say, read all of this exhaustively. I just want to point out some things in between all of these. So, the first gray block under Moses and Israel, this is the instruction that's given by Moses to the people that they are to take some of the blood, put it on two doorposts and lintel the houses where they stay, um, and will eat the Passover sacrifice. The Lord is going to pass through the land. So we're familiar very clearly with the fact this sets up the original Passover. Fast forward, we go to the point where Jesus is being crucified in Matthew 26. And when Jesus had finished saying all of these things, he told his disciples, you know that the Passover takes place after 2 days. Then the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Again, biblically speaking, this is pictured as the waters of death. Now, when we start our lesson here in Acts chapter 27, notice this. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous, since the Day of Atonement was already over. So, granted, I fully realize it's not lost on me. The Day of Atonement happens in the seventh month of the religious calendar, while the Passover happens in the first month of the religious calendar, two totally different days with different ideas and concepts in mind. But then there also is a very strong connection point, considering the fact that both of them capture the concept of atonement in play. Atonement in the sense of man and animal in the sacrificial sense are being united together as one so that the innocent sin-bearing animal can cover the sinful human image bearer, and the image bearer can ascend through the ashes and smoke of the offered carcass in its place unto the summit of God's holy mountain. That's the entire concept behind the sacrificial system that is put forward in the book of Leviticus, by means of which these people can approach Yahweh as the altar he will meet with them at, right? And that starts for them, of course, prefigured through the actual Passover offering, which of course itself is connected to the offering of Isaac and the ram in his place. So all of that to say, even though we have the Day of Atonement as being the calendar feast mentioned here, Passover is definitely looming in the background, as both of those events find very strong connecting points in the sacrifice of Jesus himself. Though he was crucified at Passover, the concept is of what he achieved with that sacrifice also encompasses the Day of Atonement. There's so much more I could say to that, but I hope that makes sense. I'll unpack that later on in more detail when we get to this Wednesday night session. So then we move on to the next gray block. We have the Lord driving back the sea to create the conduit for them to pass through the murky waters to make it to the other side, right, to achieve the Exodus. In Matthew 27, we have this rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, taking the body, wrapping it, putting it in a new tomb that he had cut into the rock. So Jesus has now begun his journey through this Exodus-like movement, passing through the murky waters of death as he's now been interred in the tomb. Of course, he's going to emerge from that victoriously. Then we go to Acts chapter 27 and continue on with that story. Paul is saying they were battered heavily by the storm. They began to throw the cargo over the side. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. For many days, neither sun or stars had appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Now, in another lesson, I'm actually going to be pointing this out with more detail in mind here, but there's a reason why this third day formula is mentioned here. Anytime we have that, from start to finish, Genesis through Revelation, 3 days is almost always connected to some sort of exile, Exodus story arc to connect the two together. One of the first mentions of that formula happens to be Abraham, 3 days into the wilderness with his son Isaac, is now seeing the place that God wants his son to be offered to him. And so then he takes Isaac to exile him into death, but then bring him out through the resurrection that God will have to achieve if Abraham really has to go through with killing his son. And on this goes, such that it is a definite concrete pattern by the time Jesus starts to announce to his disciples, I'll be crucified, and then 3 days later emerge from the grave, right? So Paul is now passing through the murky waters of death. Back to Exodus 12, Moses tells the people that they are to eat meat that night, and how they should eat it, roasting it over fire, and eat it with unleavened bread. Jesus at the Passover sacrifice is clearly going to use unleavened bread to accomplish the purpose he does when he says, this is my body given for you. But notice this. In Acts 27, Paul is now urging them after 14 days to now take food, he said. And so he takes some of the bread, he gave thanks to God, and then he broke it, following the exact same formula that Jesus did over here. And presumably this is patterned after this, right? So there's definitely some strong Passover overtones to this. Summing this up, the last gray block, the Egyptians chase the Israelites into the water. The Lord brings the water down on top of them, kills the entire army. Then the Israelites emerge victoriously at the beginning of Acts chapter 15, singing this great song of victory by the sea, as the Lord has become their rock, their salvation. Now to Matthew 28, clearly resurrection morning, Jesus has emerged victorious from the murky waters of death. But notice here in Acts 27, when daylight came, they didn't recognize land, but they sighted a bay. The soldiers had planned to kill all the prisoners so that they wouldn't escape because they can't control them anymore. But the centurion urges them, because of Paul and what Paul had said and the faith that he's now expressing, to save them all. So, indeed, they all wind up making it alive to land. So Paul's death and resurrection at sea essentially leads to the exodus of these prisoners who would have simply been put to death by their Roman overlords and jailers, had it not been for the presence of Paul on the vessel and his continuous encouragement for these people to take faith in the God he serves. And then, of course, patterning this for them by virtue of the way he conducts himself, even inviting them into this almost Passover meal-like observance, and then encouraging them to just be strong and wait to see the deliverance of the Lord, as Moses was encouraging Israel in the wilderness to be strong, wait for the deliverance of the Lord, as Jesus had tried to instill a sense of faith in his own disciples. When you see these things, you won't understand them, but you will after it's all said and done. Remember, just have faith, be still, know that I am God. So I hope that's helpful in some way in trying to connect these things together. Remember, we will talk about this in greater detail when we get to that Wednesday night session. So tune in for the next one.